Back in the early 1930s, my grandpa used to spend his time hunting gators in the Louisiana Bayou. He grew up alongside my four great-aunts and uncles in a tiny town called Rosedale, right near the Atchafalaya River and the bayous that fed into it. Life back then was tough, even before the stock market crash, but after the crash, things got even worse. Money was scarce everywhere. Folks would try their luck at shrimping or fishing, but with most people unable to afford luxuries anymore, the seafood market took a nosedive. Stores still stocked canned fish and oysters, but the workers for canneries were in short supply, and the logging crews saw demand drop to almost nothing once the economy tanked. Construction was nearly non-existent, and all of those familiar jobs everyone depended on dried up, leaving hardworking people like my grandpa with hardly any options left. One route that paid fairly well was selling moonshine, but with prohibition still in place until 1933, it was a dangerous hustle. Revenue agents were cracking down hard, and if they didn't catch you, a rival moonshiner might. There was no such thing as friendly competition when it came to selling illegal liquor. However, if you were desperate and a little reckless, there was another way to make decent money: alligator hunting. Out in the bayou outside Rosedale, the landscape was a jumble of cypress trees, tupelo gums, and narrow waterways winding between strips of land they called hammocks or house islands. Sometimes you'd come across wider open waters, but most of the gators thrived in the dense, mosquito-infested mazes, where the sunlight barely reached the water's muddy depths. And if they got enough to eat, these young gators would grow from mere 3-foot juveniles into 12-foot monsters in just 5 or 6 years. The bigger and tougher they got, the more dangerous and deadly they became. Gator trappers had to know the terrain like the back of their hand if they wanted to navigate safely through those wetlands. Many made good money guiding hunters or fellow trappers into the deep bayou, where the oldest and largest gators lurked, knowing where they nested, basked, or moved whenever the tides and rains shifted their routines. If you got it right, your haul could be impressive. A skilled team hunting from dawn till dusk might bring back 2, 3, sometimes even 4 gators in a single day. When you sold their hides for roughly $3 or $4 each, a team of 5 could split enough money and food to last their families an entire week, all from just a single day's work. It wasn't just the hides that people wanted either. If you salted the meat, it would keep longer or could be sold fresh while you kept some for yourself. Grandpa said there was even a voodoo priestess near Matt Point known as a Mambo, who paid good money for gator teeth and claws for her black magic rituals. That lucrative demand brought a lot of amateurs into the mix, especially after the economy nosedived further. Of course, gator hunting was dangerous. In those early years after the crash, dozens of inexperienced young men took off into the depths of the swamp, hoping to turn a profit but ending up dead instead. The safest method, Grandpa explained, was trapping. Hunters would bait a heavy iron or steel hook with rancid meat and hang it from a tree with a rope, like they were fishing. Grandpa said it could be deadly effective as long as it worked. But gators were just as likely to lunge out of the water, snatch the bait, and pull it off the hook without impaling themselves. Steel traps could do the job, but they were expensive, so most of the greenhorns just waited out in the swamp with rifles or shotguns, hoping luck was on their side. Very few ever made it back. The same went for the crews of boys who went out after dark, carrying oil lanterns to spot the glowing eyes of alligators. With their lanterns held high, they'd scan the murky waters. The glow of those eyes, just a brief reflection in the darkness, made it easier to find the beasts. But it was also incredibly risky. Splashing and blood in the water often turned the hunter into prey. Stray into the wrong part of the swamp, and an angry gator could destroy your boat, or even drown a man before anyone realized what was happening. Grandpa told of a hunter who was the only survivor from his team after gators tore apart their boat and ate his friends. He had to wade through the stinking swamp all night to find his way back home. The community was heartbroken over the loss, but they also felt a terrible sense of inevitability that they had lost loved ones doing what they loved. That hunter's leg had been badly bitten, and infection set in fast. His family called in a doctor from Baton Rouge, but this was long before antibiotics, so there was nothing that could save him. He died within days, and at his funeral, 3 empty coffins were lowered into the ground beside him, one for each of his fallen friends. Every time someone died in those swamps, news spread like wildfire through the parish. Yet, no one stopped going out there. People started trying to make money from the wreckage, finding abandoned camps, washed-up gear, anything that might give clues about the missing. The sheriff finally decided enough was enough, and cracked down on anyone hunting or trapping without a license, which cost $5 and took weeks to get. Still, that didn't stop the desperate and the hopeless from risking everything. My grandpa was lucky enough to have a license himself, along with a handful of other Rosedale residents. Usually, the local hunters and trappers were mostly friendly, even though competition was fierce. They'd gather at a little place called the Blind Tiger, which wasn't even its real name, just a nickname for illegal drinking spots back then, because of a joke about paying a man to see a blind tiger when you were really just buying drinks. Most nights, Grandpa and his friends Charlie and Whit would meet there, smoke cigars, swap stories, and talk about the best hunting spots of the week. Grandpa used to say he'd overheard some pretty wild rumors at that bar. But what really stuck out was a story from the summer of 1931 about a guy named Little John Guidry. He was leading a group of 4, out hunting the biggest gators they could find. One night, they saw this enormous all-white gator basking on a narrow house island, a true giant, and Guidry claimed it was at least 20 feet long, carrying about 2,000 pounds of meat and hide. His friends all vouched for him, but that beast slipped into the water before they could get to it. Grandpa said that from teeth to tail, that gator was an immense creature. Even if you didn't believe the story, the size alone was enough to turn heads. The rumor was that once the white gator was spotted, John and his crew kept going back every night hoping to find it again, convinced it was a rare albino beast. They called it Old Red Eyes, and they believed that with such a rare hide, they could buy a whole week of easy living just by selling it. One morning, John's wife woke to find he hadn't come home. It wasn't unusual for hunters to camp out overnight after a long day, especially with high tides or rains. But by evening, they still hadn't returned, and people started to worry. According to Grandpa, his wife stormed into the Blind Tiger that night, demanding to know why the other hunters hadn't gone out looking for him. The sheriff and deputies searched the swamp, but they only knew it half as well as Grandpa and his friends. John might have been injured, hiding somewhere, bleeding out among the wreckage of his boat, with hungry gators circling overhead. Grandpa thought about John's wife's words and realized she might be right. He imagined him out there, bleeding, and praying someone came to find him before the gators got him. He said he couldn't ignore the feeling that they had to do something, that turning back was not an option. So he talked to Charlie and Whit at the Blind Tiger, proposing they go deeper into the swamp to look for John and the big white gator, maybe even bringing him home alive if they were lucky. But heading into the deeper parts of the swamp meant staying overnight in darkness, which was when dangers lurked the most. They'd need extra help, 2 more hunting parties to cover all the ground. Grandpa told Charlie and Whit to gather supplies while he tried recruiting others. Most of the men thought he was crazy, but he insisted that if they didn't go, John and his crew might be lost forever, and more families would be mourning. They finally assembled 7 hunting parties, all in their small boats called pirogues, paddling deeper into the swamp early the next morning. Grandpa remembers the first day as slow and eerie. They had a 14-mile stretch of river to cover before reaching Bayou. The water was black as ink, cypress trees jutted up like ghostly sentinels, and the only sounds were the hum of their motors and the haunting calls of distant birds. Every log looked like a gator waiting to ambush. Every ripple might be a waiting monster. They searched all day and into the night, looking for signs of John, but all they saw were plenty of gators, rodents, and snapping turtles. No sign of his crew or the white gator. As dusk settled, they looked for a dry spot to camp. The bayou grew darker, and they kept paddling through the channels by lantern light and moonshine, knowing that navigating blindly was risky. Grandpa said the darkness made the swamp feel alive. All eyes reflected the glow of their lanterns, and every splash and ripple seemed to whisper threats. Finding a camp was critical, but on this night, they spotted strange lights in the distance. They thought maybe it was Gator Dupree's crew until they approached closer and saw a makeshift structure. It was a church, with a black cross painted on a white background, sitting on a house island right by the water's edge. It was eerily quiet. Grandpa and his friends pulled up and called out, and an old deacon who looked half-blind came out to greet them. When they explained they needed a place to stay, he welcomed them into the tiny church, lit only by candles, with a simple altar and the cross on the front. Grandpa told him about John, and the deacon said he'd pray for his safe return. When Grandpa mentioned the white gator, the deacon's face turned cold. He claimed he'd seen that very creature once, up close. He told them he'd been out sharing the gospel in the swamp near Catahula, when something pale and enormous slipped out of the bushes behind him and slid into the water. That thing, he said, was no mistake. It was a monster. Its splash had shaken him to his core, and he clutched the crucifix around his neck, paddling like mad to escape. Every time he looked over his shoulder, bubbles and ripples grew closer behind him. The deacon believed that Gator didn't like him at all, that it saw him as prey, and if it snapped his boat in half, he'd be drowned for sure. He recounted how he'd tried reciting Psalms, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," and somehow, just as he spoke the words, the bubbles stopped. He kept paddling, heart pounding, until the beast sank back into the depths. Grandpa said his buddy Whit told the deacon that it would take more than prayers to take down a creature that size, and the deacon turned ghostly pale again. He warned them that Old Red Eyes was no ordinary gator, that the devil moved through creatures like him, and they were playing with something far more dangerous than they understood. Still, Grandpa felt they had no choice. They had come too far to turn back now, especially when they were so close to the very heart of the swamp. At dawn, with enough light, they set off deeper into the bayou. The water was calm but slow, and they swapped their engines for paddles, trying to sneak past the most treacherous spots. The swamp was even more unsettling in the daylight. Grandpa remembered how they could see the reflection of giant gators in pools, and how the silence felt almost alive, as if the swamp itself was watching them. They came across a stretch of bald cypress trees, and through a jagged gap in the bushes, saw the grisly remains of Gator Dupree's crew, a scene so horrific it made their stomachs turn. Blood-spattered gear, an abandoned boat listing in the shadows, half-eaten bodies torn all to hell, with limbs missing and entrails spilled across the sawgrass. Grandpa said it was unlike any carnage he'd ever seen. If that was the work of a gator, it was an enormous, incredibly fast beast. They started thinking about pulling out, but the brushes and the bodies made it clear it was too dangerous to go further. Gator Dupree's crew had been vastly more experienced and outnumbered than Grandpa's team. If they couldn't handle whatever had attacked them, what chance did Grandpa and his friends stand? On their way back, they carried the heavy guilt of all that loss. They felt ashamed and defeated, but turning back wasn't an option. Suddenly, Whit pointed out a massive gator basking on a small island a good 12 feet long, possibly the one responsible for Dupree's fate. Grandpa was just about to agree when, out of nowhere, the water erupted in front of them. A monstrous 20-foot albino gator sliced from the depths, pale as death, with glowing red eyes, and attacked the smaller gator. It clamped its jaws down with a sickening crunch, thrashing wildly before being dragged into the swamp and disappearing. The huge beast sank back beneath the water, foam and blood swirling up. Grandpa's jaw dropped as they watched, frozen in shock. Then, suddenly, the water started to churn again. In seconds, a massive blur of foam and pale hide shot through the water at them at lightning speed. Grandpa paddled frantically while Whit fumbled with his shotgun, pumping shells into the beast. It surged upward, jaws wide, old red eyes was coming for them. Whit fired twice and the pellets tore into the gator's snout, blood spraying everywhere. The beast roared and reeled, wounded but not dead. It sank under, only to explode out of the water again, jaws snapping mere inches from the boat. Whit kept firing, finally connecting with a hit. This time, the massive albino thrashed and howled in pain, foam and blood streaming off it before it retreated into the swamp's shadows. The boat lurched as the beast sank back, and Grandpa said he knew they'd been given a narrow escape. They paddled with everything they had, the sound of splashing and breathing filling the swamp, until the creature finally stopped chasing. Exhausted, they reached the next bayou, where they could finally hope for safety. Grandpa remembered Whit sitting in front, eyes tired and guilt weighing on him, both of them exhausted and broken. No bodies to bury, no closure, just the terrible feeling that they'd been lucky to survive. The silence that followed was brutal. They arrived back at the dock near what is now Rama's place near sunset, legs shaking, and left their boat tied up as they headed into town. The reunion with families was heartfelt. Grandpa's mother threw her arms around him, ignoring the smell of swamp. Charlie's little sister clung to his leg, and the church praised Jesus for their safe return. Grandpa remembered how proud his mother was. Even though they left empty-handed, it was the trying that counted. But the worst part was the news of the other crew members. Gator Dupree's mother fell apart when she learned her son was not coming back, and the families who had gone out to find John and the others found tragedy instead. More black clothes, more mourning, as if the swamp itself was playing some sick joke. Grandpa felt the guilt gnaw at him. Why had he survived, while so many hadn't? How could he live with himself after turning tail that night? He told me he carried that weight for a long time, but later, at John's funeral, his widow's words helped lighten some of it. She told him how much she appreciated his trying to bring her husband back. That meant everything. Eventually, Grandpa gave up gator hunting for good. After that encounter with old red eyes, he traded the swamp for the fields, met a girl named Betty Bigger, and they got married under the cypress trees in spring 1941. Sadly, the draft came in 1942, and he went off to fight in Europe, helping liberate villages from Normandy to the Rhine. When he returned home, he started a family, and years later, Grandpa would sit by the fire and tell us his story about meeting old red eyes. Every time, he'd swear that no battle ever made his blood run colder than that day. He and his boys stared into the crimson glare of that giant albino gator, almost dragging them straight to hell. Fast forward to 1999. Two brothers from South Florida, James and David Adams, headed into the Big Cypress Swamp expecting a routine hunting trip. The swamp, sprawling and wild, filled with cypress strands, marshes, and pine flatwoods, was familiar territory to them. Armed and riding an ATV, they ventured deep into the wilderness to hunt deer and small game. But what started as a simple trip turned into a 6-day nightmare, testing their stamina and sanity. Things went wrong when their ATV sputtered and died far from any roads. That engine, usually reliable, just stopped in the middle of the swamp. Cell phone reception, non-existent. So they decided to abandon the ATV and try to find their way back on foot, hoping to navigate by the sun and their experience. But the heavy rains from the previous days had flooded the swamp, erasing landmarks and turning dry patches into muddy quagmires. They quickly realized they were hopelessly lost as the sun set, and with temperatures dropping into the 40s, they had no jackets or blankets. Instead, they huddled together beneath a cypress, shivering and soaked. Night in the swamp was unsettling. The sounds of guttural alligators, skittering rodents, and dripping water filled the darkness. James remembered hearing a splash nearby, convinced it was a gator sizing him up, and he tried to stay calm, finger on his rifle. Every twig snap sent a jolt through his chest. Hunger and thirst set in fast. They had little supplies and resorted to drinking dirty, stagnant swamp water that tasted like rotten decay, Yet dehydration was more dangerous than any bacteria. Their boots were heavy with mud, and their legs ached from walking through the mud. By the second day, David was showing signs of exhaustion, and James urged him onward. Both were weak, their faces hollow from hunger and fatigue. They needed help fast. On the third day, they stumbled across a woefully dilapidated hunter's camp, just a wooden platform half sunk in the water. There were no supplies, but it was a brief refuge. They tried to make a fire with damp twigs and their lighter, but it was no use. That night, rain poured down and flooded their patch of ground, forcing them back into the swamp. By the fourth day, they were exhausted, hypothermia creeping in. David's lips turned blue, and he started to ramble incoherently. James, desperate and terrified, tied their belts together to keep him close. He feared losing his brother forever. They functioned on fragile hope, listening for helicopter search parties overhead. Morning of day 5 finally brought a faint sign of hope: dry ground. They built a small fire with their last bit of lighter fluid, praying someone saw the smoke. Their bodies were battered and broken, feet raw, faces gaunt. The swamp had grown bolder and shadows kept watch. James saw an alligator's eyes reflecting their firelight. Ready to attack, he aimed his rifle, trembling. Miraculously, the shot hit, causing the beast to thrash and retreat. They kept paddling, exhausted but alive, until a helicopter appeared on the horizon. Ropes dropped, and paramedics rushed them to a hospital in Naples, dehydrated, hypothermic, and barely standing. Doctors marveled at their survival 6 days in the swamp with no food, only contaminated water and surrounded by predators. They'd been lucky. James and David recovered physically, but the mental scars ran deep. James later told reporters, "Every night I heard them waiting out there." Their story became legendary, a story of incredible resilience and the swamp's savage danger. Across the country, other stories of survival and horror unfolded. The Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia, once an ancient hunting ground for native tribes and later a refuge for escaped slaves, is now a protected wildlife sanctuary filled with diverse animals, and even the occasional alligator that slips up from North Carolina. But in the late 1980s, it was the scene of one of the most chilling crimes of that decade. Thomas Lee Bonney, born and raised in Chesapeake, Virginia, ran a successful auto salvage yard. He married Dorothy May in the late 60s, and they had 6 children. Thomas was devout and reasonable, but also deeply troubled, haunted by an abusive, neglectful father who had beat him and his siblings. He confided in his wife about his childhood scars, and she tried to support him. But Thomas's overprotection turned overbearing. His teenage daughter, Kathy, started rebelling. She dropped out of high school, defied his strict rules, and started dating a married man much older than herself. Thomas found a letter in her desk, graphic, adult, revealing his fears about her relationship. He warned her about the dangers of infidelity and violence, but she ignored him. In November 1987, Thomas's fears exploded into tragedy. He took Kathy to a neighborhood 7-Eleven to meet someone named John, supposedly to look at a car she wanted to buy. Thomas insisted on watching the meetup, but after her test drive, she wanted to take the car for just a little longer against his warning. That night, they disappeared. The next day, Thomas reported her missing, but the police assured him she was an adult and could walk off on her own. Still, he was frantic. Weeks later, a hunter named James Sawyer found Kathy's body in a remote part of the swamp. She'd been shot multiple times, beaten severely, and posed unnaturally on the ground. The evidence pointed to a terrible crime. A search of her room uncovered a partly finished letter to her lover, and her remains were confirmed by fingerprints. Thomas was devastated. He tracked her car, only to find bloodstains in it, revealing he'd been right about her dangerous relationship. Terrified, Dorothy May reported her husband to the police. He fled during the night, and after 2 months of searching, he was caught in Indiana. During his interrogation, psychologists used hypnotherapy to explore his mind. They uncovered multiple personalities, including Satan, Mama, Damien, Viking, Tommy, Hitman, Preacher, Dad, and Kathy herself, all created from childhood trauma. One side claimed Kathy was alive and visited him in his cell every night. Doctors said Thomas suffered from severe dissociative identity disorder, a reaction to past horrors, but the prosecution challenged this. A psychiatrist who reviewed the case argued that his supposed dissociative states were poorly handled and questioning under hypnosis had been suggestive. They believed he'd murdered Kathy in a fit of rage after confronting her about her affair, then staged her death to look like a lover's crime. Evidence eventually led to his conviction. He appealed, but his sentence was upheld. In 1994, he escaped from prison in a daring attempt through a trash compacting chute, then hid inside a garbage truck initially believed to have been crushed. He later stole a car and drove to Hampton Beach. Bonnie was captured 4 days later, claiming he just wanted to visit his mother's grave and apologize to his daughter for failing to protect her. So, that's the long story. A tale of tragedy, bravery, and the dark, unforgiving nature of the swamp, a place where monsters aren't just in the stories, but live right beneath the surface, waiting.